My name is Amanda Wilson and I'm 26 years old. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine being dragged to court by my own aunt claiming I owed her $50,000 for raising me after my parents died. The betrayal cuts deeper when it comes from someone who was supposed to protect you when you were at your most vulnerable. But sometimes life's harshest lessons come from the people we least expect. Before I tell you how a judge's words silenced my greedy aunt forever, hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever had to stand up against a family member who tried to take advantage of you. And let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. I grew up in Mapleton, a small Midwestern town where everyone knew each other by name. My childhood was the kind most kids dream of, simple but filled with love. My dad, Michael Wilson, worked as a construction foreman. He had calloused hands but the gentlest touch when he'd scoop me up after a long day at work. Every Friday, he'd bring home a single wildflower he'd found on his job site. For my best girl, he'd say, tucking it behind my ear. Dad was the kind of man who built things to last. Our backyard treehouse still stands after 15 years, though I haven't climbed it since I was 12. My mom, Sarah, taught 3rd grade at Mapleton Elementary. She had this magical ability to make learning an adventure. At home, our kitchen table often transformed into a science lab or an art studio. Mom believed in living education, turning everyday moments into lessons about the world. She made the best chocolate chip cookies in town, and somehow always knew exactly when I needed one. Her laugh was infectious, starting soft and building until her whole body shook with joy. We weren't wealthy by any stretch. Our house was modest, a 3-bedroom ranch-style home with faded blue siding that Dad was always promising to repaint next summer. But my parents were meticulous about financial planning. They lived below their means, drove cars until they practically fell apart, and put money away every month without fail. "We're not saving for things," Mom would explain, "we're saving for security." Our family traditions were simple but meaningful. Sunday morning pancakes shaped like whatever I requested. Dad's specialty was dinosaurs. Summer camping trips to Lake Wanatee where we'd count stars and roast marshmallows until I couldn't keep my eyes open. The annual Wilson Family Talent Show where we'd perform ridiculous acts for an audience of stuffed animals. These memories are like photographs in my mind, vivid and precious. I was 12 when everything changed. It was an ordinary Tuesday in April. Rain had been falling steadily all day, making the roads slick. My parents were driving home from their anniversary dinner, 17 years together. They never made it. A truck driver fell asleep at the wheel, crossed the center line, and hit them head-on. They died instantly, I was told later, as if that somehow made it better. I was at my best friend Caitlin's house when the police came. Her mother answered the door, and I still remember the way her face crumpled when they spoke. The next few hours passed in a blur. Sitting numb on Caitlin's couch. The phone calls. Adults speaking in hushed tones. Being driven to the police station where my mother's sister, Aunt Deborah, was waiting. The funeral was held 3 days later. The entire town seemed to attend. My parents had touched so many lives. I sat in the front row, wearing a black dress Mom had bought me for a piano recital, feeling like I was watching someone else's life through a dirty window. I couldn't cry. Not then. The grief was too enormous, too consuming. It felt like I'd been hollowed out. After the service, there was a gathering at our house. People brought casseroles and spoke in soft voices about memories of my parents. I escaped to my room, unable to bear one more pitying look or awkward pat on the shoulder. That's when Aunt Deborah found me. "There you are," she said, sitting beside me on my bed. "I know this is hard, sweetie. But we'll figure it out together." Aunt Deborah lived 2 hours away in Riverside. I'd seen her a few times a year at holidays and family gatherings. She was my mother's only sibling, 5 years younger, with the same auburn hair but none of Mom's warmth. Still, in that moment, I was grateful for any family I had left. A week after the funeral, Mr. Harrington, my parents' lawyer, sat me down with Aunt Deborah to discuss arrangements. That's when I learned about my parents' life insurance policy, $150,000 designated for my care. They also had about $30,000 in savings. All of it would be managed by my guardian until I turned 18. Your parents named Deborah as your guardian in their will, Mr. Harrington explained gently. The funds will be transferred to her to manage for your benefit. I looked at Aunt Deborah, who squeezed my hand. I'll take good care of you, she promised. And your parents' money. At 12, I didn't fully understand the implications of this arrangement. I was just grateful not to be alone. When Aunt Deborah suggested I move in with her, I agreed without question. What choice did I have? My childhood ended the day my parents died, but I had no idea that moving in with Aunt Deborah would bring a different kind of hardship. As we packed up my belongings, I noticed Aunt Deborah eyeing my parents' possessions. We'll need to sell most of this, she said matter-of-factly. My place isn't big enough for all this stuff. But these are my parents' things, I protested. They're just things, Amanda, she replied, her tone suddenly sharp. We need to be practical now. That was my first glimpse of the real Aunt Deborah, practical to the point of coldness. But I told myself she was right. She was the adult. She knew best. And I was lucky she'd taken me in. That became her mantra over the years, how lucky I was that she'd sacrificed her freedom to raise her sister's child. I had no idea then just how much she'd make me pay for that sacrifice. Moving to Riverside felt like being exiled to a foreign country. Aunt Deborah's apartment was in a sterile high-rise building, all chrome and glass with none of the warmth of my childhood home. My new bedroom was actually her home office, hastily converted with a futon and a small dresser. We'll get you proper furniture once we're settled, Aunt Deborah said. That never happened. Within weeks, I realized that Aunt Deborah and my mother might have shared DNA, but they couldn't have been more different in how they approached life and parenting. Where my mother had been nurturing and patient, Aunt Deborah was critical and short-tempered. Where my father had been generous and affectionate, Aunt Deborah was calculating and cold. You need to understand something, she told me after I'd been living with her for a month. I never planned on having children. I put my career on hold to take care of you. That's a big sacrifice. Aunt Deborah worked as a real estate agent, and she made sure I knew exactly how much my presence was costing her in potential commissions. She kept a running tally of expenses, school supplies, clothes, even groceries, often sighing dramatically as she updated her spreadsheet. Your parents left money for your care, I ventured to remind her once. Her eyes narrowed. That money is for your future. College, emergencies. I'm not touching it for day-to-day expenses. That would be irresponsible. I believed her then. I didn't know that she'd already begun dipping into my inheritance. Small withdrawals at first, $500 here, $1,000 there, for household improvements or educational enrichment. When I'd ask about specific purchases like new clothes for school, she'd make me feel guilty. Do you have any idea how expensive it is to raise a child? She'd snap. Your parents may have spoiled you, but I can't afford to. By the time I was 14, Aunt Deborah had remodeled her kitchen with high-end appliances and granite countertops. It's an investment in the property, she explained when I admired the changes. That same week, she complained about buying me new shoes after I outgrew my old ones. The emotional toll was even worse than the financial manipulation. Aunt Deborah had a talent for making me feel like a burden. If I got sick, she'd make a show of rearranging her schedule, sighing heavily as she called clients to reschedule appointments. This is what I've had to give up, she'd mutter, just loud enough for me to hear. When I was 15, Aunt Deborah decided I should get a part-time job. It's time you learned some responsibility, she declared. You need to understand the value of $1. I started working weekends at a local grocery store, bagging groceries and collecting shopping carts. The pay was minimum wage, but Aunt Deborah immediately instituted what she called room and board. 30% of my paycheck went straight to her for household expenses. But isn't that what my parents' money is for? I asked. That money is for your future, she insisted. This is about teaching you to contribute. You're old enough now to help with expenses. I was working 15 hours every weekend while trying to maintain my grades. My parents had always emphasized the importance of education, and I was determined not to disappoint their memory. Studying until midnight became my new normal. Aunt Deborah never once asked about my homework or offered to help. When report cards came, she'd glance at them briefly and say, "Good." College is like consistent performance. College became my escape plan. I threw myself into schoolwork and extracurricular activities, anything that would strengthen my applications and potentially earn scholarships. I stayed at school as late as possible, volunteering for every committee and club that would have me. The less time at Aunt Deborah's apartment, the better. The summer before my senior year, I was accepted into a prestigious academic program at the local university. When I showed Aunt Deborah the acceptance letter, her first question wasn't about the opportunity, it was about the cost. "There's a $300 program fee," I told her. "But it would look amazing on my college applications." "I suppose we could use some of your inheritance for that," she said reluctantly. It was the first time she'd explicitly acknowledged using that money for anything. "How much is left?" I asked, suddenly concerned. She waved her hand dismissively. "Enough. But college is expensive, Amanda. Don't get your hopes up about fancy private schools." I applied to 12 colleges my senior year, including my dream school, Northwestern University. When the acceptance letters started arriving in spring, I was ecstatic to receive offers from 7 schools, including Northwestern. Even better, I qualified for partial scholarships at most of them. "I need to talk to you about the inheritance money," I told Aunt Deborah one evening, spreading the financial aid packages on the kitchen table. "Even with scholarships, I'll need to cover remaining tuition and living expenses." Her expression shifted, a mix of annoyance and something else, guilt, maybe? "There's been a change in the financial situation," she said carefully. "What does that mean?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "The market hasn't performed well," she explained vaguely. "And there have been necessary expenses over the years. Your braces. That summer camp. School trips. How much is left?" I demanded. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "About $40,000. I felt like I'd been punched. "That's impossible. There was $180,000 6 years ago." "Don't take that tone with me," she snapped. "Do you have any idea how expensive it is to raise a teenager? Food, clothes, utilities. It adds up. Those are normal guardian expenses." I protested. "The inheritance was supposed to be for college." "Well, we'll just have to be creative," she said coldly. "Choose a cheaper school. Take out loans like everyone else. That's the real world, Amanda." I was devastated, but also suspicious. That night, I searched her home office while she was out with friends. In the back of a filing cabinet, I found statements for the trust account, and discovered the truth. Aunt Deborah had been systematically draining my inheritance for years. New car. Luxury vacations labeled as necessary mental health breaks from childcare responsibilities. Expensive jewelry. Home renovations. All while making me work part-time and feel guilty for needing new clothes. I confronted her when she came home, statements in hand. Instead of shame, she showed only indignation. "I deserved compensation for raising you," she said. "Your parents had no right to saddle me with a child and expect me to sacrifice everything. The money helped make it worthwhile." In that moment, I saw her clearly for the first time, not as the guardian who'd rescued me, but as someone who had seen a traumatized child as a financial opportunity. I made my decision that night. I would go to Northwestern, my dream school. I would figure out student loans and work study and whatever else it took. Most importantly, I would get away from Aunt Deborah. Northwestern University's campus was everything I'd dreamed of: Gothic buildings, lakefront views, and most importantly, 300 miles between me and Aunt Deborah. I moved into my freshman dorm with everything I owned packed into 2 suitcases and a backpack. My roommate, Lindsay, arrived with her parents in an SUV crammed with coordinated bedding, decorative pillows, and enough snacks to feed our entire floor. "Where's your family?" she asked as she unpacked. "It's just me," I replied, smoothing my plain blue comforter over the thin dorm mattress. Lindsay's parents exchanged a look I'd grown familiar with, that mixture of pity and discomfort. But Lindsay just nodded. "Cool. Want to help me hang these lights?" "I'm too short." That was the beginning of my first real friendship since losing my parents. Lindsay never pushed for details about my family situation, but she naturally included me in everything. When her parents visited, they brought care packages for both of us. When she went home for weekends, she always brought back her mother's homemade cookies to share. But college wasn't all new friends and freedom. The financial reality was harsh. The partial scholarship covered about 60% of my tuition, but I still needed to pay for the remainder plus room and board. The $40,000 left from my inheritance wouldn't even cover 2 years of expenses. I maxed out my federal student loans and took a job at the university library working 20 hours a week. During holidays when the dorms closed, I stayed with Lindsay's family rather than returning to Aunt Deborah's. I didn't speak to my aunt for nearly 6 months after starting college. When she finally called, it was to ask when I'd be coming home for summer break. "I'm not," I told her. "I found a sublet apartment near campus and picked up extra shifts at the library plus a waitressing job." "Don't be ridiculous," she scoffed. "You're working too much already. Your grades will suffer." "I finished my freshman year with a 3.8 GPA, I said, unable to keep the pride from my voice. "While working 20 hours a week." There was a pause. "Well, that's good," she finally said. "But what about your inheritance money? You should have plenty left for summer expenses." "I'm trying to make it last," I replied, not mentioning that I was already mentally calculating how to stretch it across 4 years. Sophomore year brought a new challenge and unexpected blessing. I enrolled in Professor Rebecca Hayes' psychology course as an elective. Professor Hayes was brilliant, tough but fair, with a reputation for pushing students to their best work. 3 weeks into the semester, she asked me to stay after class. "Your analysis of attachment theory was exceptional," she said, leaning against her desk. "Have you considered a psychology major?" "I'm pre-law," I explained. "I want to become a family attorney." "Interesting choice," she nodded. "May I ask why?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on the how of my education, scholarships, loans, work hours, that I hadn't really examined the why of my career choice. "I want to help protect vulnerable people," I finally said. "Especially children." Something in my voice must have revealed more than I intended. Professor Hayes studied me thoughtfully. "If you ever want to talk, my office hours are Tuesday and Thursday afternoons." 2 weeks later, after a particularly difficult phone call with Aunt Deborah about money, I found myself outside Professor Hayes' office. I hadn't planned to go there, but something pulled me to her door. Over cups of tea, my story spilled out: my parents' death, Aunt Deborah's emotional manipulation, the disappeared inheritance. Professor Hayes listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly concerned. "Amanda," she said gently when I finished, "what you've experienced is a form of financial abuse. Your aunt was legally obligated to use that money for your benefit, not hers. She says she deserved it for raising me," I said, repeating the justification I'd heard so many times. "That's not how guardianship works," Professor Hayes explained. "When your parents named her as your guardian, she accepted a responsibility, not an entitlement to compensation." That conversation marked the beginning of my healing. Professor Hayes became my mentor, helping me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't normal or acceptable. She connected me with campus resources, including free counseling sessions for students. Through therapy, I began to recognize patterns in my behavior: my reluctance to ask for help, my excessive self-reliance, my fear of being a burden. All stemmed from years of Aunt Deborah's conditioning. Identifying these patterns was the first step toward changing them. Junior year brought a breakthrough in the form of a prestigious legal internship. The position came with a stipend that allowed me to reduce my library hours. My supervisor, attorney James Mercer, was impressed with my work ethic and understanding of family law. "You have a natural instinct for these cases," he told me after I helped research a complex custody dispute. "Most interns your age don't grasp the nuances." "I've had some personal experience with guardianship issues," I admitted. By senior year, I had built a small but solid support network: Lindsay and her family, Professor Hayes, attorney Mercer, and a few close friends who knew pieces of my story. I maintained minimal contact with Aunt Deborah, usually brief, tense phone calls around holidays. When I graduated with honors, these people, my chosen family, cheered from the audience. Aunt Deborah didn't attend, claiming a scheduling conflict with an important house showing. I pretended it didn't hurt. The real victory came 2 weeks after graduation when I was offered a paralegal position at Mercer's firm. The salary wasn't exceptional, but it was enough for me to rent a small apartment and start building a life completely independent from Aunt Deborah. "I'm proud of you," Professor Hayes told me over celebration dinner. "You've overcome more obstacles than most of your peers will ever face." For the first time in years, I felt a sense of stability. I had my own place, a job in my chosen field, and plans to apply to law school after gaining some work experience. I was healing, learning to trust, finding my footing. Then came the phone call that shattered my hard-won peace. It was a Tuesday evening in June, almost 2 years after graduation. I was preparing a simple dinner in my apartment while reviewing case notes for work the next day. When my phone rang displaying Aunt Deborah's number, I nearly declined the call. We hadn't spoken in over 3 months, not since a tense exchange at Christmas when she'd commented on my expensive gift to Lindsay's parents, a handmade photo album that had cost me less than $30 in materials. Curiosity won out. "Hello? Amanda. Darling." Aunt Deborah's voice was oddly cheerful. "How are you? It's been too long." I balanced the phone between my ear and shoulder, continuing to chop vegetables. "I'm fine. Busy with work. How are you?" "Oh, you know me, always hustling in this real estate market. But I've been thinking about you. We should get together soon. Catch up properly." Her friendly tone made me uneasy. Aunt Deborah was never friendly without an agenda. Still, I found myself agreeing to meet her for coffee that weekend. Maybe, I thought, she was trying to make amends. Saturday arrived, and I spotted Aunt Deborah at a corner table in the cafe, impeccably dressed as always. Her hair was freshly highlighted, her nails perfectly manicured. The large designer bag beside her probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Amanda." She stood to embrace me, enveloping me in a cloud of expensive perfume. "You look healthy." I recognized the subtle criticism, Aunt Deborah's specialty. I'd gained a few pounds since college, no longer skipping meals to save money. "Thanks," I said dryly, sliding into the seat across from her. "You wanted to catch up?" We exchanged superficial pleasantries for about 15 minutes, her real estate successes, my paralegal work, the unseasonably warm weather. Just as I was beginning to think I'd misjudged her intentions, she set down her coffee cup with purpose. "Amanda, I need to discuss something important with you," she said, her voice taking on a businesslike tone. "It's about financial matters." My guard instantly went up. "What about them?" "Well, as you know, I took you in during the most difficult time in your life. I provided food, shelter, clothing, emotional support, all the necessities for 6 formative years." I nodded cautiously, unsure where this was headed. "I've been working with a financial advisor recently," she continued, reviewing my retirement planning. "It's made me realize that I made significant financial sacrifices to raise you, sacrifices that have impacted my long-term security." "Aunt Deborah," I said slowly, "you had access to my inheritance money. Money specifically left by my parents for my care." Her expression hardened slightly. "That barely covered the basics. Do you have any idea what it costs to raise a teenager? The emotional labor alone is worth thousands." A sick feeling began to form in my stomach. What exactly are you saying? She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table with manicured fingers. I've calculated the outstanding balance of what you owe me for your upbringing. After accounting for the inheritance money I already used, you still owe me $50,000. I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. Excuse me? $50,000, she repeated firmly. For room, board, and emotional labor beyond what was covered by your inheritance. With shaking hands, I opened the folder. Inside was a meticulously itemized list spanning several pages. Bedroom furniture and decor, $3,200. The futon and small dresser couldn't have cost more than $500 combined. Transportation to and from school activities, $4,860. I'd taken the public bus most days. Clothing allowance, $12,000. She'd complained about every pair of shoes, every winter coat. This is insane, I whispered, flipping through the pages. Parents and guardians don't charge children for raising them. I wasn't your parent, she snapped. I was your guardian who stepped in when no one else would. That deserves compensation. You already took compensation, I said, my voice rising. You spent most of my inheritance on yourself, money my parents specifically left for my care and education. Aunt Deborah's eyes narrowed. That money was for necessary expenses. This, she tapped the folder, is for everything else. The countless hours driving you to activities, helping with homework. You never helped with homework, I interrupted. Not once in 6 years. Don't be dramatic, she dismissed. The point is, I put my life on hold for you. Now I'm approaching retirement age, and I need to ensure my financial security. This is ridiculous, I said, closing the folder and pushing it back toward her. I don't owe you anything. Her expression changed then, a cold smile spreading across her face. I was afraid you might feel that way. That's why I've already consulted an attorney. If you don't agree to a payment plan, I'll take you to court. On what grounds? I asked incredulously. Unjust enrichment. Implied contract. There are legal precedents. She sounded rehearsed, as if she'd practiced this speech. My attorney thinks we have a solid case. This is extortion, I said, standing up so abruptly my chair scraped loudly against the floor. Several nearby patrons looked over. Think about it, Aunt Deborah said calmly, seemingly unaffected by my reaction or the attention we were drawing. I'd prefer to handle this privately, but I'm prepared to make this a legal matter if necessary. I'll expect your answer within 2 weeks. I left the cafe in a daze, the conversation replaying in my mind. By the time I reached my apartment, shock had given way to rage. How dare she? After everything she'd already taken from me, not just money, but years of emotional well-being, she wanted more? My hand shook as I called the one person I knew would understand the legal implications, my boss, Attorney Mercer. She's bluffing, he assured me after I explained the situation. No court would uphold a guardian's demand for payment for basic care. That's not how guardianship works. She seems very confident, I said. Claims she has legal precedents. I'd be interested to see those, he replied skeptically. Look, come into the office Monday. We'll go through this together. The weekend passed in a blur of anxiety and anger. I dug through old financial records, trying to piece together exactly how much of my inheritance Aunt Deborah had spent and on what. The more I looked, the worse it appeared. Expensive renovations to her condo. A luxury car purchased just months after becoming my guardian. Multiple vacations, including a 2-week European cruise while I stayed with a neighbor. Monday morning, I brought everything to Attorney Mercer. He reviewed the documents with increasing concern. Amanda, based on these records, your aunt misappropriated funds that were supposed to be held in trust for you, he said gravely. That's not just unethical, it's potentially criminal. What should I do? I asked. First, absolutely do not agree to pay her anything, he advised. Second, I'd recommend we send a formal letter stating your position and suggesting she drop this matter entirely, or you'll be forced to consider a countersuit for misappropriation of your inheritance. The letter was sent the next day. Aunt Deborah's response came a week later, not to me, but in the form of actual lawsuit papers delivered to my apartment. Summons, Deborah Lancaster vs. Amanda Wilson, the heading read. The amount sought, $50,000 plus legal fees. My hands trembled as I called Attorney Mercer again. She really did it. She's actually suing me. His voice was calm but concerned. Bring the papers in tomorrow. We'll handle this. And Amanda? Don't worry. This lawsuit is so outrageous it might actually backfire on her spectacularly. I wanted to believe him, but as I stared at the official court documents, all I could think was that Aunt Deborah was once again attempting to profit from my parents' death, and this time, she was using the legal system to do it. The lawsuit papers lay spread across my coffee table like a map of betrayal. Each legal phrase, each formal accusation felt like another twist of the knife Aunt Deborah had planted in my back years ago. I'd barely slept since receiving them, my mind racing with memories and questions. How had the woman my mother loved enough to name as my guardian become someone who would sue her own niece? Attorney Mercer had offered to represent me pro bono, but I declined. This is too personal, I explained. And you've already done so much for me. At least let me refer you to someone good, he insisted. Someone who won't charge you an arm and a leg. That's how I met Rachel Thompson, a family law attorney with a reputation for taking on unusual cases. She worked at a small firm that operated on a sliding scale fee structure for clients with financial need. At our first meeting, she reviewed Aunt Deborah's lawsuit with an expression that shifted from confusion to outrage. In 15 years of practice, I've never seen anything quite like this, she said, setting down the documents. Your aunt is essentially trying to charge you retroactively for fulfilling her legal obligations as your guardian. Can she actually do that? I asked. Legally? No. The obligation of a guardian is to provide care using the ward's assets appropriately, plus their own resources if necessary. There's no provision for guardians to charge for their time or emotional labor, as she puts it. Rachel's air quotes dripped with disdain. But the real question is why a judge hasn't thrown this out already. Her attorney is Gregory Simmons, I explained. Apparently he's well connected with several local judges. Rachel nodded grimly. Simmons is known for taking outrageous cases if the client can pay his fees. He usually finds some obscure legal theory to justify the suit, just enough to get past initial dismissal. So what do we do? We prepare as if this is going to trial, she said firmly. And we dig deep into your aunt's financial management of your inheritance. That's our counter-strategy. The next few weeks became a crash course in financial forensics. Rachel connected me with Jordan Blake, a forensic accountant who specialized in cases of financial exploitation. Together we combed through every bank statement, every withdrawal, every purchase I could document from my years under Aunt Deborah's guardianship. Based on the records we've been able to obtain, your aunt spent approximately $137,000 of your inheritance on expenses that had nothing to do with your care, Jordan concluded after weeks of investigation. The new kitchen, the European cruise, the luxury car, none of these qualify as expenses for your benefit. Can we prove that in court? I asked. The timing of these expenditures is damning, he replied. The kitchen renovation began 3 weeks after she became your guardian. The car was purchased 2 months later. These weren't planned expenses, they were opportunistic splurges after she suddenly gained access to a substantial sum of money. Rachel incorporated these findings into our legal strategy, preparing a countersuit for misappropriation of funds. We won't file it yet, she explained. First, let's see how the initial hearing goes. This might be enough leverage to get her to drop the case entirely. But Aunt Deborah didn't drop the case. If anything, she escalated her campaign, calling mutual acquaintances from my childhood to express concern about my refusal to acknowledge her sacrifices. One former neighbor even called me, awkwardly explaining that Deborah had been in tears about my ingratitude. She told me she's only asking for a small portion of what she spent raising you, the neighbor said uncomfortably. Did she mention that my parents left money specifically for that purpose? I asked. Money she spent on home renovations and luxury vacations? The silence on the other end spoke volumes. As the court date approached, Rachel suggested we gather character witnesses, people who could speak to both my character and Aunt Deborah's behavior during her guardianship. Your friend Lindsay would be good, she advised. She saw your living situation firsthand when you were in college. Professor Hayes too, she can speak to the psychological impact of your aunt's behavior. Reaching out to people for help didn't come naturally to me. Years of Aunt Deborah's conditioning had left me reluctant to burden others with my problems. But when I finally made those difficult calls, the responses overwhelmed me. Of course I'll testify, Lindsay said immediately. I remember how you stretched every dollar in college while your aunt drove that ridiculous BMW she bought with your money. Professor Hayes was equally supportive. Amanda, what your aunt did was financial exploitation of a minor. I'd be glad to explain the psychological impact to the court. Even my high school guidance counselor, Mr. Fernandez, whom I hadn't spoken to in years, agreed to provide a statement about Aunt Deborah's conspicuous absence from school events and her constant complaints about the burden of raising me. 3 days before the court date, Rachel arranged a settlement conference, a final attempt to resolve the matter without trial. Aunt Deborah arrived with her attorney, Gregory Simmons, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who oozed insincere charm. My client is willing to reduce her claim to $35,000 as a good faith gesture, he offered, sliding a document across the table. Rachel didn't even glance at it. My client rejects any payment demand. Furthermore, we've prepared a countersuit for misappropriation of inheritance funds totaling $137,000. We're prepared to file it immediately if this matter proceeds to trial. For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across Aunt Deborah's face. She leaned over to whisper something to her attorney. Perhaps we could discuss a mutual walk away, Simmons suggested after their whispered conference. Both parties agreed to drop all claims. That's not acceptable, Rachel replied coolly. Ms. Wilson has suffered real financial harm. Walking away doesn't address that. You can't seriously expect my client to pay her niece for fulfilling her guardianship duties, Simmons scoffed. No, we expect your client to return the money she misappropriated from a trust fund intended for her orphan niece's care and education, Rachel corrected. Money that was used for kitchen renovations and European vacations while Amanda worked part-time jobs in high school to buy basic necessities. The settlement conference ended in a stalemate. As we left, Aunt Deborah caught my arm in the hallway. You're making a mistake, she hissed, her friendly facade completely gone. I gave up years of my life for you. And you compensated yourself quite generously with my inheritance, I replied, pulling my arm away. See you in court. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. What if the judge sided with Aunt Deborah? What if her attorney's connections gave her an unfair advantage? The logical part of my brain knew our case was stronger, but the wounded part, the part still carrying the scars of Aunt Deborah's emotional manipulation, whispered doubts. At 3 a.m., I called Lindsay. What if she wins? I asked without preamble when she answered groggily. She won't, Lindsay said, instantly alert despite the hour. But even if some bizarre legal anomaly occurred and she did, you have friends. You have people who love you for real, not for what they can get from you. We wouldn't let you face this alone. Her words were the comfort I needed. Whatever happened in court tomorrow, I realized I was no longer the isolated, vulnerable child Aunt Deborah had manipulated for years. I had built something she could never take away, genuine connections with people who cared about me without keeping a ledger of what I owed them. The morning of court, I dressed carefully in a conservative navy suit, hair pulled back neatly, minimal makeup. I wanted to project competence and stability. Rachel had coached me on courtroom demeanor: speak clearly, address the judge as your honor, answer only what was asked. Remember, she said as we waited outside the courtroom, Judge Stevenson has reviewed all the documentation we submitted. She knows about your parents' death, the inheritance, your aunt's spending patterns. All of that is already in the record. Today is about filling in the human elements of the story. I nodded, too nervous to speak. Through the crowd, I spotted Aunt Deborah arriving with her attorney. She wore an expensive-looking cream suit and had styled her hair in a softer, more maternal way than her usual sharp bob. Even now, she was calculating, crafting an image designed to support her narrative. Our eyes met across the hallway. For a moment, I saw something unexpected in her expression, not anger or determination, but fear. In that instant, I realized she was scared. Perhaps she was finally facing the possibility that her actions would have consequences. As the bailiff called our case and the doors to courtroom 3 opened, I took a deep breath. Whatever happened today, I would face it with the truth on my side and genuine support behind me. I was no longer the powerless child Aunt Deborah had manipulated all those years ago. I was ready. Courtroom 3 was smaller than I'd imagined from watching legal dramas. The wood paneling gave it a solemn atmosphere, and the morning light filtering through vertical blinds cast striped shadows across the floor. As we took our places at the plaintiff and defendant tables, I tried to steady my breathing. Aunt Deborah sat primly at her table, occasionally leaning over to whisper to her attorney. She'd carefully crafted her appearance for maximum sympathy, subtle makeup to emphasize the lines of supposed stress around her eyes, a modest pearl necklace that had belonged to my mother. The sight of that necklace, one of the few family heirlooms she hadn't sold, made my blood boil. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Marilyn Stevenson," the bailiff announced. Judge Stevenson entered briskly, a tall woman with silver-streaked dark hair and piercing eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Her reputation for no-nonsense efficiency had preceded her. "Be seated," she said, adjusting her glasses as she settled behind the bench. "Lancaster versus Wilson. I've reviewed the filings. Mr. Simmons, as you represent the plaintiff, you may begin." Gregory Simmons rose smoothly, buttoning his expensive suit jacket. "Thank you, Your Honor. This case, at its heart, is about fairness and compensation for extraordinary service. 6 years ago, my client, Deborah Lancaster, received the devastating news that her sister and brother-in-law had died in a tragic accident. Without hesitation, she stepped forward to become guardian to their 12-year-old daughter, the defendant. He gestured toward me as if I were an exhibit rather than a person. Ms. Lancaster put her own life on hold, her career, her social life, her personal pursuits, to provide a stable and loving home for her niece during the most difficult time in the child's life. While the parents did leave a modest sum for their daughter's care, that money was designated primarily for education and future needs, not for the day-to-day expenses of raising a teenager. I fought to keep my expression neutral as he continued his narrative, painting Aunt Deborah as a selfless martyr who had sacrificed everything for me. Over 6 years, Ms. Lancaster provided food, shelter, clothing, transportation, emotional support, and guidance, all without compensation. Now that Ms. Wilson is a successful adult with a career, my client is simply asking for reasonable recognition of the sacrifices she made. The sum of $50,000 represents just a fraction of the actual value of services rendered during those years. Judge Stevenson's expression remained unreadable. "You're arguing that a legal guardian is entitled to retroactive compensation beyond the use of the ward's assets specifically designated for their care?" "In extraordinary circumstances, yes," Simmons replied smoothly. "The law recognizes the concept of unjust enrichment, where one party confers benefits on another without receiving fair compensation." "I'm familiar with the concept, Mr. Simmons," Judge Stevenson said dryly. "Please call your first witness." Aunt Deborah took the stand, swearing to tell the truth with a solemn expression that might have convinced anyone who didn't know her. Under Simmons' careful questioning, she described receiving the news of my parents' death, the immediate and selfless decision to take me in, and the countless sacrifices she'd made over the years. "I had to reduce my work hours as a real estate agent," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Prime selling hours are evenings and weekends, but I needed to be home for Amanda. That alone cost me tens of thousands in potential commissions. She described driving me to school activities, helping with homework, a complete fabrication. Staying up with me when I was sick, and providing emotional support through the trauma of losing her parents. Each statement twisted the truth so expertly that I found myself wondering if she actually believed her own narrative. The inheritance money was carefully managed for Amanda's benefit, she continued. College was always the priority. I used it only for necessary expenses directly related to her care and education. When Simmons asked about her current financial situation, Aunt Deborah's voice trembled slightly. I'm approaching retirement age with inadequate savings because I prioritized Amanda's needs over my financial security. All I'm asking for is some recognition of the sacrifices I made, sacrifices any parent would make, but I wasn't her parent. I was her aunt who stepped up when she had nowhere else to go. Rachel made notes throughout the testimony, her expression betraying nothing. When it was time for cross-examination, she approached the witness stand with calm confidence. Ms. Lancaster, you testified that you used the inheritance money only for expenses directly related to your niece's care and education. Is that correct? Yes, of course, Aunt Deborah replied. Then perhaps you could explain this withdrawal of $32,000 from the trust account in July 2012, just 3 months after you became Amanda's guardian? Rachel placed a bank statement on the evidence projector. Aunt Deborah shifted uncomfortably. That was for household improvements necessary to accommodate a teenager. Interesting. And would those improvements include the complete kitchen renovation with high-end appliances documented in these receipts? Rachel displayed the receipts, dated the same month. Did Amanda, at 12 years old, require a $9,000 professional-grade range and $6,000 in custom cabinetry? The entire household benefited from those improvements, Aunt Deborah said defensively. Including the property value of your condominium, which increased significantly as a result, Rachel noted. Let's move on to this withdrawal of $12,000 in April 2013. One by one, Rachel methodically connected large withdrawals from my inheritance account to Aunt Deborah's personal expenditures, the luxury car, the European cruise, designer clothing, jewelry. With each example, Aunt Deborah's explanations grew more convoluted. The reliable transportation was necessary for Amanda's activities, she insisted when questioned about the BMW. Yet Amanda testified in her deposition that she primarily used public transportation, Rachel countered. By the time cross-examination ended, Aunt Deborah's carefully constructed image had crumbled. Her face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. After a brief recess, Rachel called me to the witness stand. As I was sworn in, I caught sight of Lindsay and Professor Hayes in the gallery, both offering encouraging smiles. Amanda, could you describe your living situation after moving in with your aunt? Rachel began. I recounted the hastily converted office that served as my bedroom for 6 years, never upgraded despite promises. I described working part-time jobs throughout high school, with Aunt Deborah taking a portion of my earnings for room and board. I explained how I'd discovered the systematic draining of my inheritance only when I needed it for college. How did you finance your education? Rachel asked. I received a partial scholarship to Northwestern, but it wasn't enough, I explained. I worked 20 hours a week at the university library and took out the maximum student loans. During summers and holidays, I worked full-time, sometimes 2 jobs. Did your aunt provide financial assistance for college? No. She told me what remained of my inheritance, about $40,000, was all she could provide. It barely covered 2 years of expenses. And did your aunt ever express that she expected payment for raising you? Never, I said firmly. Not until she called me 2 months ago, almost 8 years after I moved out. As Rachel guided me through my testimony, I maintained composure, even when describing painful memories. I wasn't there for revenge or to punish Aunt Deborah. I simply wanted the truth recognized. When Simmons cross-examined me, his approach was to suggest I'd been an ungrateful, difficult teenager who didn't appreciate the sacrifices made for me. Isn't it true that many teenagers have conflicts with their guardians? He asked. That's a normal part of adolescence, isn't it? I wouldn't know what's normal, I replied evenly. I was dealing with the death of both my parents while living with someone who constantly reminded me I was a burden. His questions grew increasingly hostile, trying to provoke an emotional reaction that would undermine my credibility. I remembered Rachel's coaching: stay calm. Stick to facts. Don't let him bait you into anger. Isn't it possible your aunt's recollection of events is simply different from yours, rather than deliberately deceptive? Simmons suggested. It's not a matter of recollection, I responded. Bank statements don't lie. The inheritance money was spent on luxury items for her while I worked part-time jobs to buy basic necessities. After my testimony, Rachel called Jordan Blake, the forensic accountant, who methodically walked through the financial evidence showing how Aunt Deborah had spent my inheritance. His testimony was devastating in its precision. Based on my analysis, Ms. Lancaster spent approximately $137,000 of the inheritance funds on expenses that cannot reasonably be considered for Amanda's care or education, he concluded. Professor Hayes testified about the psychological impact of financial exploitation and emotional manipulation on young trauma survivors. Lindsay described my struggles in college, working multiple jobs while Aunt Deborah drove a luxury car purchased with my inheritance money. By the time all witnesses had testified, the contrast between Aunt Deborah's narrative and the documented reality couldn't have been clearer. As the attorneys delivered their closing arguments, I noticed Judge Stevenson's expression had shifted from neutral to increasingly troubled. After Simmons finished his final plea for fair compensation for extraordinary service, Judge Stevenson removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. I've heard enough, she said. I'll deliver my ruling after a 15-minute recess. Those 15 minutes felt like hours. Rachel squeezed my hand reassuringly. You did wonderfully, she whispered. No matter what happens, you stood up for yourself with dignity and truth. When Judge Stevenson returned, the courtroom fell silent. In my 30 years on the bench, she began, I have encountered many family disputes over money. But rarely have I seen a case that troubles me as deeply as this one. She turned her gaze directly to Aunt Deborah, who seemed to shrink under her scrutiny. Ms. Lancaster, when you agreed to become your niece's guardian following the tragic death of her parents, you accepted a sacred trust. That role does not come with an expectation of payment or future compensation. It comes with legal and moral obligations to act in the best interest of the child. Judge Stevenson shuffled through the evidence documents. The financial records presented to this court tell a disturbing story. Far from sacrificing for your niece's benefit, you appear to have treated her inheritance as a personal windfall. The kitchen renovation, the luxury car, the European vacation, these were not expenditures for Amanda's benefit. They were for yours. Aunt Deborah's face had gone pale. Furthermore, the judge continued, requiring a high school student to pay room and board from part-time job earnings while her inheritance funds were being used for your lifestyle improvements represents a profound breach of your fiduciary duty as her guardian. Judge Stevenson set down the documents and leaned forward. This lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice. Ms. Lancaster is entitled to no compensation whatsoever for fulfilling the guardianship role she voluntarily accepted. Relief flooded through me, but the judge wasn't finished. Additionally, I am referring this matter to the prosecutor's office for potential criminal charges regarding misappropriation of trust funds. And I strongly advise Ms. Wilson to pursue a civil action for recovery of misused inheritance funds, for which this court would look favorably upon. Aunt Deborah gasped. But Your Honor, I took her in when no one else would. I gave up. Ms. Lancaster, Judge Stevenson interrupted sharply, you did not give up anything. You helped yourself to a vulnerable child's inheritance while making her feel like a burden for needing basic care. That is not guardianship. That is exploitation. The judge's words hung in the air like thunder. Aunt Deborah's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She was, for perhaps the first time in her life, completely speechless. As Judge Stevenson gathered her papers and prepared to leave, she looked at me with unexpected gentleness. Ms. Wilson, the court commends your resilience in the face of these difficult circumstances. You have conducted yourself with remarkable dignity throughout these proceedings. With a final rap of her gavel, the case was over. Rachel hugged me tightly, and I felt tears of relief stinging my eyes. Across the courtroom, Aunt Deborah sat frozen, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. As we left the courtroom, I felt as though a weight I'd carried for 14 years had finally been lifted. The judge had seen the truth. Justice had been served. And most importantly, I had stood up for myself at last. The courthouse steps felt symbolic, each one taking me further from the past and closer to a future free from Aunt Deborah's shadow. Rachel walked beside me, still reviewing the judge's ruling with understated triumph. A complete dismissal with prejudice means she can never file this claim again, she explained. And the referral to the prosecutor's office, that's extraordinary. Judge Stevenson clearly saw through your aunt's facade. I nodded, still processing the enormity of what had just happened. I never expected her to suggest criminal charges. Financial exploitation of a ward is a serious matter, Rachel said. Particularly when it involves a minor who's recently experienced trauma. The judge recognized that. Lindsay and Professor Hayes waited for us at the bottom of the steps, their faces anxious until they saw my expression. Lindsay rushed forward, enveloping me in a fierce hug. You won? She asked against my shoulder. Completely, I confirmed. The judge dismissed her case and suggested I countersue for the misused inheritance money. Professor Hayes smiled warmly. Justice doesn't always prevail in courtrooms, but today it did. I'm proud of you, Amanda. As we stood there planning an impromptu celebration lunch, the courthouse doors burst open. Aunt Deborah emerged, her face flushed with humiliation and rage. Her attorney trailed behind, attempting to calm her, but she shook off his restraining hand. Amanda, she called sharply, causing heads to turn. This isn't over. You've ruined me. Rachel stepped protectively between us. Ms. Lancaster, I strongly advise you not to approach or communicate with my client. The judge's ruling was clear. But Aunt Deborah wasn't interested in legal advice. Her carefully constructed persona had completely collapsed, revealing the true nature I'd known for years. I took you in when no one wanted you, she shouted, her voice echoing off the stone facade of the courthouse. I gave you a home. I sacrificed everything. Each accusation was like a flashback to my teenage years, the constant reminders of my supposed burden, the subtle and not-so-subtle emotional manipulation. But this time I wasn't a vulnerable child. I was an adult who had just been vindicated in court. You didn't sacrifice, Aunt Deborah, I said calmly. You profited. And now everyone knows it. She advanced another step, finger pointed accusingly. You ungrateful little. Ms. Lancaster. Judge Stevenson's authoritative voice cut through the scene. She stood at the top of the courthouse steps, her robe still on, expression severe. This display is inappropriate and borders on harassment. I suggest you leave immediately before you compound your legal difficulties. Aunt Deborah froze, suddenly aware of the spectacle she was creating and the additional witness to it. For a moment, she seemed caught between rage and self-preservation. Then, with a final glare in my direction, she allowed her attorney to guide her away toward the parking lot. Judge Stevenson descended the steps until she reached our group. Ms. Wilson, are you all right? Yes, Your Honor. Thank you, I replied, surprised by her personal intervention. Good. She adjusted her glasses. I rarely step outside my courtroom like this, but I couldn't ignore what was happening. She lowered her voice slightly. What I'm about to say is not as a judge, but as someone who has seen too many cases like yours. Don't let her take any more from you, not your peace, not your future, not another moment of worry. She's taken enough. With a slight nod, Judge Stevenson continued down the steps and walked toward the judicial parking area, leaving me stunned by her compassion. That, said Lindsay after a moment of odd silence, was incredible. And excellent advice, Rachel added. Now, about that civil suit for recovery of funds. Over lunch at a nearby cafe, Rachel outlined the process for filing a civil suit to recover the misappropriated inheritance money. Based on the judge's ruling today, we have a very strong case. Judge Stevenson has essentially laid the groundwork for us. Do I really want to go through another court case? I wondered aloud, pushing pasta around my plate. It doesn't have to go to trial, Rachel explained. With today's ruling and the threat of criminal charges, your aunt might be willing to settle. We can start with a demand letter. Professor Hayes, who had joined us for lunch, offered her perspective. Amanda, pursuing this isn't just about the money. It's about accountability. For years, your aunt acted with impunity, using your inheritance as her personal fund while making you feel guilty for existing. There should be consequences for that behavior. And practically speaking, Lindsay added, that money was meant for you. For your education, your start in life. Recovering even part of it could help with your student loans. They were right, of course. The money wasn't the point, it was the principle. And practically, my student loan burden was substantial. Even recovering a portion of the misused funds would make a significant difference in my financial future. Let's do it, I decided. Send the demand letter. But I don't want to drag this out forever. I'll consider a reasonable settlement if it means putting this behind me. Rachel nodded approvingly. That's a healthy approach. I'll draft the letter tomorrow. After lunch, I received an unexpected call from Mr. Fernandez, my high school guidance counselor, who had submitted a written statement for the case. I just heard from another teacher that you won, he said when I answered. I wish I could say I'm surprised by what your aunt did, but I'm not. I saw red flags years ago. What do you mean? I asked. She never attended a single parent-teacher conference, he explained. Never responded to emails about your achievements. When you won that essay contest junior year, we couldn't even reach her to tell her you'd be recognized at the school assembly. These weren't the actions of a dedicated guardian. His words hit me hard, another confirmation that what I'd experienced wasn't normal or acceptable. Why didn't you say anything back then? He sighed heavily. I tried, actually. I made a report to Family Services expressing concern about potential neglect. But without evidence of physical abuse or immediate danger, and with your excellent grades and apparent adjustment, it didn't go anywhere. I should have tried harder, and I'm sorry for that. His apology brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Someone had noticed. Someone had tried to help. It hadn't worked, but the effort itself meant something. Thank you for trying, I said sincerely. And thank you for your statement. It helped. The weeks following the court case brought significant changes. Rachel sent the demand letter to Aunt Deborah, outlining the evidence of misappropriated funds and proposing a settlement of $100,000, less than the full amount identified by the forensic accountant, but still substantial. Initially, there was no response. Then, 3 weeks later, Aunt Deborah's new attorney, Simmons, had apparently withdrawn from representing her, contacted Rachel to negotiate. After several rounds of discussion, we settled on $65,000, paid in monthly installments over 5 years, secured by a lien on her condominium. It's less than she took, Rachel acknowledged when presenting the offer, but it's guaranteed, and it avoids years of litigation. Plus, the prosecutor's office is still reviewing the case for potential criminal charges. I accepted the settlement. The money would help with my student loans, but more importantly, the agreement represented accountability, something Aunt Deborah had avoided for too long. On the advice of both Rachel and Professor Hayes, I began seeing a therapist specializing in family trauma. Dr. Bennett helped me recognize the lasting impacts of Aunt Deborah's emotional manipulation, my difficulty accepting help, my excessive self-reliance, my tendency to downplay my own needs. These were survival mechanisms, Dr. Bennett explained during one session. They helped you cope in an environment where expressing needs was punished. But now they're limiting your ability to form balanced relationships. Working through these patterns was challenging. There were sessions where I left Dr. Bennett's office emotionally drained, memories and realizations hitting me like physical blows. But gradually, I began to recognize unhealthy patterns and develop new responses. I learned to accept help without immediately calculating how to repay it. I practiced expressing needs and wants without apologizing. I began to understand that genuine relationships aren't transactional. People who truly care don't keep ledgers of what you owe them. 6 months after the court case, I received the first settlement payment from Aunt Deborah. The check arrived without a note, which was fine with me. We hadn't spoken since that day on the courthouse steps, and I had no desire to re-establish contact. I used that first payment to host a thank you dinner for the people who had supported me through the ordeal: Rachel, Lindsay and her parents, Professor Hayes, Jordan Blake, and a few close friends who had offered encouragement throughout the process. "I want to toast all of you," I said, raising my glass at the restaurant table. "Not just for helping me win a court case, but for showing me what real support looks like. What real family looks like." "To chosen family," Lindsay responded, raising her glass. "To justice," added Rachel with a smile. Professor Hayes considered her words carefully before speaking. "To healing, past and future." The healing she mentioned was ongoing. There were still difficult days, still moments when Aunt Deborah's voice echoed in my head, making me question my worth or right to take up space. But those moments grew less frequent as I surrounded myself with genuine connections. I channeled some of my healing into volunteering with a local organization that supported children in the foster care system. Many of these kids had experienced similar betrayals by the adults who should have protected them. Working with them gave purpose to my pain. If my experience could help even one child feel less alone, it was worth sharing. During one volunteer session, I met Sarah, a 16-year-old whose situation eerily paralleled my own, orphaned at 12, placed with a relative who seemed more interested in the associated benefits than in her well-being. After several mentoring sessions, she confided her fears about asking for basic necessities. "I don't want to be a burden," she said, the familiar words striking deep. "You're not a burden, Sarah," I told her firmly. "Needing things, clothes, school supplies, even emotional support, that's not being burdensome. That's being human. The adults in your life are supposed to provide those things. That's their job." "But my aunt always says." "I know what she says," I interrupted gently. "I heard the same things. And I believed them for a long time. But they're not true." The doubt in her eyes was painfully familiar. "How do you know?" "Because someone wise once told me that family, real family, doesn't keep a ledger of what you owe them." A year after the court ruling, I received a call from the prosecutor's office. After reviewing the evidence, they had decided not to pursue criminal charges against Aunt Deborah. While her actions were clearly inappropriate, the evidence is several years old, and she's complying with the civil settlement, the assistant district attorney explained. "Given the backlog of current cases involving active abuse, we've decided to focus our resources elsewhere." Initially, I felt a flash of disappointment. Part of me had wanted to see Aunt Deborah face more severe consequences. But as I reflected, I realized the outcome was actually ideal. The civil settlement provided financial restitution, and Aunt Deborah was facing something perhaps worse than criminal charges for someone like her: social consequences. Many of her friends and colleagues had learned about her actions through the court case, and her carefully cultivated image had been permanently damaged. More importantly, I was free. Free from her manipulation, free from the burden of unanswered questions about my inheritance, free to build my life on my own terms. That freedom allowed me to make choices based on what I truly wanted, not just what would help me survive. I applied to law school with the goal of specializing in family law and child advocacy. I deepened friendships without constant fear of being too needy. I even started dating Jason, a kind and patient man who understood my history and never made me feel guilty for having needs. On quiet evenings, I sometimes thought about my parents, what they would think of the woman I'd become, the life I was building. I liked to believe they would be proud. Not just of my professional accomplishments or educational achievements, but of my resilience. Of my capacity to trust and love despite what I'd experienced. Of my determination to use my pain to help others. The inheritance they left me wasn't just financial, it was the foundation of love and security they built during my first 12 years. Aunt Deborah had managed to take much of the money, but she couldn't take those formative years or the values my parents instilled in me. In the end, that was the more valuable inheritance. Family isn't just about blood, it's about who truly cares for you without keeping a ledger of what you owe them. My parents understood that. And now, despite everything Aunt Deborah did to undermine it, I understand it too. If you've ever had to stand up against someone who tried to take advantage of you, especially someone who was supposed to protect you, I hope my story gives you courage. There's healing on the other side of speaking your truth. There's freedom in setting boundaries. And there's family, real family, waiting to be found or created. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and justice. Have you ever had to confront a family member who betrayed your trust? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might help someone else feel less alone in their struggle. Remember, the family we choose is sometimes stronger than the family we're born into. Wishing you all the courage to stand up for yourselves and the wisdom to surround yourselves with people who truly deserve your trust.